My husband brought his 23-year-old assistant into our home like I was completely invisible. I did not scream. I packed. He smirked, thinking I would crawl back and beg for my old life. But that night, I walked out with something he never noticed was missing. 3 days later, his calls would not stop, and when he found out the truth, it was already beyond saving. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away in absolute silence to protect your worth and your sanity. It was a Tuesday evening when my entire marriage shattered into a million pieces. I am Chloe, 34 years old, and I work as a financial risk management director. I had just returned a day early from a grueling business trip in Chicago. The drive back to our sprawling mansion in Buckhead, Atlanta, was supposed to be a quiet end to a very long week. I pulled my car into the circular driveway, taking a moment to admire the towering columns and the perfectly manicured lawn. This house was a massive statement piece. It was the physical manifestation of Black excellence and wealth that my husband Marcus absolutely loved to flaunt to his friends, his colleagues, and our entire church community. Marcus was 36 years old and an investment fund manager. He wore custom-tailored suits, drove luxury European cars, and carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who firmly believed he was the untouchable king of the world. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door, expecting to find him in his study working late, tracking the stock market or perhaps watching a basketball game in the media room. Instead, the house was eerily quiet except for the muffled sound of giggling and low whispers coming from the formal living room. I set my briefcase down on the marble floor, taking off my heels so I would not make a sound. I walked softly down the long hallway, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. The sight that greeted me froze the blood in my veins. Right there on our custom emerald green velvet sofa, the exact piece of furniture I had spent months sourcing from a designer in Italy, was my husband. And he was not alone. Wrapped tightly in his arms was Jasmine, his 23-year-old assistant. She was practically sitting on his lap, her hands tangled in his expensive silk shirt, while he kissed her with a passionate intensity I had not seen from him in years. For a fraction of a second, my brain completely refused to process the visual information. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of building a life, constructing an image, and managing a massive financial empire together. I had expected many challenges in our marriage, but walking into my own sanctuary to find a girl barely out of college draped over my husband was simply not one of them. I did not gasp. I did not drop my keys or scream his name. I just stood there in the archway, letting the cold reality wash over me. I watched them until the heavy silence of the room finally made Marcus pull away. He looked up and his eyes locked onto mine. Most men would jump out of their skin. Most men would shove the other woman away, stammer a pathetic apology, or fall to their knees and beg for forgiveness right then and there. Not Marcus. He slowly untangled himself from Jasmine and stood up. He reached down, smoothed the wrinkles from his custom suit jacket, and looked me dead in the eye. There was no panic on his face. There was only a cold, deeply arrogant smirk. "You see it," he said, his voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any guilt or remorse. "Jasmine is moving in today." I stared at him, my face an unreadable mask, while a hurricane of betrayal and rage churned violently in my chest. Jasmine did not even have the decency to look ashamed or embarrassed by the fact that she was sitting in a married woman house. She crossed her arms over her chest and offered me a provocative little smile, leaning back against the cushions of my sofa as if she had already claimed her throne. "This house is in my company name," Marcus continued, taking a confident step toward me with his chin raised high. "You have exactly 1 hour to pack your things and get out." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the warm air of the living room. He truly believed he held all the power in this dynamic. He believed that just because his name was plastered on the front-facing documents of our investment firm, that he was the untouchable master of our universe. He had spent so long playing the role of the brilliant self-made millionaire that he had actually forgotten the fundamental truth of our relationship. He had forgotten exactly who built the stage he was currently standing on. I looked at Jasmine, who was now eyeing my designer coat with undisguised envy. She was young, naive, and completely blinded by the illusion of his immense wealth. She thought she had just won the ultimate prize. Then I looked back at Marcus. The man I had vowed to love and cherish through sickness and health was looking at me like I was an annoying pest he had finally decided to exterminate. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to fall apart right there on the Persian rug. I felt a strange, terrifying calm wash over me, starting from my toes and reaching all the way to my fingertips. I did not scream. I did not grab the expensive crystal vases decorating the side tables and hurl them at his head. I did not drag that arrogant little girl by her hair out the front door and down the long driveway. Because screaming would mean he had broken me. Screaming would mean he had power over my emotions and my reactions. Instead, I simply smiled. It was a slight, chilling smile that made Marcus narrow his eyes in sudden confusion. He was waiting for the breakdown. He was waiting for the hysterical wife trope so he could feel entirely justified in his cruelty. But I refused to give him that satisfaction. I turned on my heel and walked toward the grand staircase. My bare feet made no sound against the hardwood steps, but my presence was commanding. Each step I took was a conscious, deliberate decision to sever the emotional ties that had kept me bound to a man who saw me as nothing more than an accessory to his massive ego. The walk to the master bedroom felt like moving through deep water. I opened the door to the room we had shared for years. His expensive watches were lined up perfectly on the dresser. His signature cologne still lingered heavily in the air, reminding me of the man I thought I knew. I walked straight to my expansive walk-in closet and pulled down a single small black suitcase. I did not pack my designer dresses. I did not pack the expensive jewelry he had bought me for our anniversaries just to put on a show for his colleagues and our church friends. I packed exactly 3 days' worth of practical clothes, my laptop, and my personal identification documents. I zipped the suitcase shut with a sharp, decisive sound. My mind was operating with absolute laser precision. In corporate finance, risk management is about assessing a massive threat and neutralizing it before it can destroy your core assets. Marcus had just made himself the biggest liability of my entire life, and I was preparing to neutralize him completely. I rolled the small suitcase out of the bedroom and down the hallway, leaving behind the illusion of a perfect marriage and stepping into the reality of a woman scorned. I stood there in the center of the grand living room, surrounded by the expensive Italian furniture I had spent months curating. The silence in the room was so absolute, I could hear the faint hum of the central air conditioning. Marcus stood there with his chest puffed out, waiting for the explosion. Jasmine leaned against the armrest of the custom emerald green velvet sofa, wearing a triumphant smirk that practically begged for a physical altercation. They both wanted a screaming match. They wanted the stereotypical reaction of a broken woman whose entire universe revolved around the man who had just discarded her. But screaming is what you do when you are powerless. Screaming is what happens when someone takes something from you that you cannot replace. Instead of giving them the chaotic spectacle they craved, I let a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy or even amusement. It was the cold, calculating smile of a predator, watching its prey step willingly into a trap. I saw the immediate shift in Marcus. His jaw tightened, and the arrogant gleam in his eyes flickered into brief confusion. He did not understand my reaction. How could he understand it when he spent his entire life coasting on the financial infrastructure I built for him in the shadows? He truly believed he held the upper hand because his name was on the mortgage. He had no idea I owned the bank holding the debt. I turned my back on them without uttering a single word. My silence was absolute and it was weaponized. I walked toward the grand sweeping staircase in the foyer. The sound of my heels striking the imported hardwood floors echoed through the massive house like the steady ticking of a countdown clock. I did not rush. I ascended the stairs with perfect posture, keeping my chin high and my shoulders back. Each step was a physical detachment from the last 10 years of my life. I was not a victim fleeing a crime scene. I was a chief executive officer initiating a hostile takeover. When I reached the second floor, I bypassed the guest rooms and headed straight for the master suite. Pushing open the heavy double doors, I stepped into the room we had shared for a decade. The space reeked of his expensive cologne and his towering ego. His collection of designer watches sat displayed on the dresser, like trophies of a self-made man. I ignored all of it. I walked directly into my expansive walk-in closet, bypassing rows of designer gowns, custom suits, and the diamond jewelry he loved to buy me after closing deals I had secretly engineered for him. I reached up to the highest shelf and pulled down a single unassuming black leather carry-on suitcase. I unzipped it with a sharp, quick motion. I did not pack clothes. I did not pack shoes or sentimental photographs. Nostalgia is a useless emotion when you are preparing for war. Instead, I moved to the custom vanity island in the center of the closet. I pressed a hidden release latch underneath the marble countertop, causing a concealed drawer to slide open smoothly. Inside this drawer was the real foundation of our Buckhead lifestyle. I pulled out thick waterproof folders containing the heavy artillery of my financial arsenal. I packed my original birth certificate, my passport, and my social security card. Then I packed the incorporation documents for 7 different shell companies, registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. I packed the master ledgers, the irrevocable trust agreements, and the absolute power of attorney documents that gave me total unrestricted control over every single asset Marcus thought he owned. He believed he was the brilliant rainmaker of Atlanta. He was nothing but a highly paid mascot. I placed the folders neatly into the suitcase and zipped it shut. It weighed barely anything, but it carried enough leverage to bankrupt him before sunrise. I gripped the handle of the suitcase and rolled it out of the master suite. The wheels glided silently over the plush hallway runner. I was halfway to the stairs when I paused. There was one final asset I needed to retrieve to ensure his complete and utter destruction. I turned and glided past the main corridor, heading straight for the double oak doors of Marcus's private home office. This room was his sanctuary. It was a monument to masculine pride, filled with dark mahogany leather club chairs and framed magazine articles praising his financial acumen. I stepped inside, leaving my suitcase by the door. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights, filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I walked directly to the back wall, where a large abstract painting hung under a dedicated brass picture light. Marcus loved to brag to his fraternity brothers and country club friends about the impenetrable biometric wall safe hidden behind this specific painting. He considered it his ultimate vault, the one place in the house where he held total supreme authority. I reached out and swung the painting outward on its concealed hinges. The sleek titanium face of the wall safe gleamed in the shadows. Marcus had changed the electronic passcode just 3 weeks ago, making a huge show of covering the keypad with his body so I could not see the numbers. He honestly thought I was just a supportive wife who handled the interior decorating while he managed the complex world of high finance. He had no idea I had installed the security system myself and possessed the master override code. I raised my hand and typed a sequence of 8 digits into the keypad without a single moment of hesitation. The screen flashed green and the heavy titanium locking bolts retracted with a deep, satisfying thud. The thick metal door swung open, revealing the contents of his precious vault. Inside sat stacks of banded emergency cash, several velvet boxes containing his most exclusive timepieces, and folders of what he believed were his most secure private contracts. I did not touch the cash. The money was irrelevant compared to what I was really here for. My eyes locked onto the middle shelf. Resting perfectly in the center, sitting on a small piece of dark velvet, was a military-grade encrypted black USB drive. I reached my hand inside the safe. My fingers closed tightly around the cold, hard casing of the drive. If there had been a camera capturing this exact moment, it would have zoomed in tight on my hand, gripping that piece of plastic and metal, highlighting the ultimate secret weapon that was about to obliterate his entire reality. This tiny drive was the kill switch to his life. It contained the master access keys to the offshore accounts, the digital routing numbers that funded his firm, and the undeniable digital footprint, proving that his entire investment fund was entirely dependent on capital I controlled. Without this drive, he could not move a single dime. Without this drive, his upcoming multi-million-dollar Midtown acquisition would instantly collapse into dust. I slipped the encrypted black USB drive securely into the inner zippered pocket of my designer handbag. I closed the heavy door of the wall safe, ensuring the titanium bolts locked back into place. I swung the abstract painting back into its original position, adjusting the frame so it hung perfectly level. There was absolutely no visual evidence that the safe had been breached. Marcus was far too arrogant and far too distracted by his new young lover to bother checking his impenetrable vault tonight. He would not realize the drive was gone until he tried to log into his corporate accounts tomorrow morning and found himself locked out of his own life. I walked back to the office door and grabbed the handle of my small suitcase. My heart beat with a steady, powerful rhythm. I was no longer just a wife walking out on a cheating husband. I was the architect of his impending ruin, leaving the building before the demolition sequence began. I stepped out of the office and turned toward the grand staircase, ready to face him one last time. I stood at the top of the sweeping staircase, looking down into the grand foyer. Marcus and Jasmine were still there, exactly where I had left them. They looked like a poorly cast commercial for newly acquired wealth. Marcus had his arms crossed over his chest, projecting an aura of absolute dominance, while Jasmine clung to his side, wearing a triumphant smirk. She was already mentally redecorating the space. She probably thought my single piece of luggage meant I was walking away with nothing but the clothes on my back. I descended the stairs with a steady, rhythmic pace. My heels struck the imported marble tiles with a sharp clack that echoed off the high ceilings. Marcus watched me, expecting tears or trembling hands. He wanted to see a broken woman begging for a second chance or screaming in a fit of jealous rage. Instead, he saw a woman operating with cold mechanical precision. I reached the bottom floor and did not even pause. I walked right past them, the wheels of my suitcase gliding smoothly across the floor, as if they were nothing more than ghosts haunting a house I no longer cared about. "Where do you think you are going?" Marcus demanded, his voice trailing after me as I reached for the heavy brass handle of the front door. He sounded genuinely annoyed that I was not putting up a fight. He needed the dramatic confrontation to validate his narrative. He needed me to act like a hysterical liability so he could feel like the rational provider upgrading to a newer model. I did not bother to answer him. I pulled the front door open and stepped out into the humid Atlanta night. The warm evening air wrapped around me, a stark contrast to the freezing reality I had just left behind inside. I walked down the brick steps and headed straight for my car, parked in the circular driveway. It was a sleek black sedan, unassuming but powerful, entirely paid for in cash under one of my corporate entities. Marcus followed me out, letting the heavy screen door slam shut behind him. He could not stand my silence. It ate at his massive ego. He needed to have the last word to secure his pathetic victory. I popped the trunk and lifted my small suitcase inside, shutting it with a solid, definitive thud. As I walked around to the driver's side door, Marcus stepped up to the edge of the porch, pointing a rigid finger at me. "You will be crawling back," he yelled, his voice cutting through the quiet suburban neighborhood. "You hear me? You will be crawling back, begging for my money when you realize you cannot survive out here without me. You have nothing." I opened my car door and slid into the driver's seat, pressing the ignition button. The engine roared to life with a quiet hum. I pressed the button to roll down my window, resting my arm casually on the doorframe. I looked at him standing there in his expensive suit, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine hanging directly over his neck. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying authority that carried perfectly through the night air. "Enjoy the house, Marcus," I said, my expression deadpan, "and you might want to enjoy the climate control while it lasts, because your utilities and all your credit cards will be cut off at exactly 8 in the morning tomorrow." Marcus let out a harsh, mocking laugh. It was loud and abrasive, a desperate attempt to brush off a threat he thought was completely baseless. "You are out of your mind," he scoffed, taking a step forward toward the driveway. "You do not have access to my accounts. You are just a risk manager. You do not control my firm or my money." I held his gaze for a long moment, letting the absolute certainty in my eyes pierce through his arrogant facade. He was a man who only understood the surface level of wealth. He saw the luxury cars, the expensive dinners, and the flashy watches. He never bothered to look at the wiring beneath the floorboards. He never bothered to trace the routing numbers that funneled capital into his pristine investment firm. I rolled the window up slowly, cutting off whatever insult he was preparing to hurl next. I shifted the car into gear and pressed the accelerator, gliding down the driveway and leaving him standing on the porch next to his new assistant. As the heavy iron gates of the neighborhood closed behind me, I merged onto the main highway, heading toward the heart of the city. The glowing skyline of Atlanta stretched out before me, a grid of power and money. Marcus honestly believed he was a titan of this city. He believed the narrative he had sold to his country club friends and our church community. He thought I was just a dependent wife, a smart but ultimately subordinate partner who managed the household logistics while he brought in the millions. He had no idea that his entire reality was a carefully constructed diorama, and I held the title deed to the building it was housed in. Over the last 7 years, I had not just been managing risk for a corporate firm. I had been quietly establishing a labyrinth of offshore holding companies and anonymous trusts. Marcus Investment Fund was entirely propped up by capital that flowed through entities I legally controlled. The house he just kicked me out of was mortgaged through a subsidiary I owned. The credit cards he used to buy Jasmine diamond tennis bracelets were guaranteed by my personal assets. He thought he was cutting me loose, but he had actually just severed his own life support system. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling a profound sense of liberation wash over me. The small black drive resting in my purse was all I needed to dismantle his life brick by brick. By morning, his black cards would decline. His corporate accounts would freeze. The massive commercial real estate acquisition he was banking on in Midtown would evaporate instantly when the parent company Apex Capital abruptly pulled its funding. He thought he was playing a game of chess, but he was not even on the board. I was the board. The digital dashboard in my car glowed softly, illuminating my calm reflection in the windshield. I was not driving toward a hotel to cry myself to sleep. I was not a victim seeking shelter. I was driving toward my mother house, knowing exactly the kind of toxic reception waiting for me there. My family worshipped Marcus and the money he supposedly possessed. They cared more about keeping up appearances than they did about my well-being. They were about to show me their true colors, defending a cheating husband just because they thought he was the one funding their lifestyle. But I was ready for them. The gloves were officially off. I was about to teach every single person who underestimated me a very expensive lesson in true power. I pulled into the pristine, brightly lit driveway of my mother house in Alpharetta. The exterior was illuminated by perfectly angled landscape lighting, showcasing a home built entirely on the perception of flawless grace and upper-class respectability. My mother Brenda was a woman who treated her social standing at the local church like a royal title. To her, perception was not just reality. It was her entire currency. I hauled my single black suitcase up the brick steps and unlocked the front door with my spare key. I could hear the clinking of crystal glasses and the low, self-important murmur of conversation coming from the formal sitting room. I stepped into the arched doorway. My mother sat in her high-backed velvet armchair, wearing a silk robe and her signature pearls, looking as if she were posing for a magazine spread on Southern elegance. My younger sister Nia lounged on the adjacent love seat with her feet tucked under her. Next to Nia sat her husband, Bradley. Bradley was 35, a white finance bro who practically lived in quarter zip fleece vests and treated every casual family gathering like a high-stakes networking event. He worked in the same corporate wealth management industry as Marcus and worshipped the ground my cheating husband walked on. They all stopped talking the moment my suitcase wheels rattled against the hardwood floor. "Chloe," my mother said, her perfectly arched eyebrows pinching together in immediate, unfiltered disapproval. "What on earth are you doing here at this hour with luggage? Did you ruin Marcus' business trip by coming back early and causing a fuss?" "I came back a day early," I said, keeping my voice deadpan and entirely devoid of the tears they likely expected. I walked into our living room and found Marcus sleeping with his 23-year-old assistant on our custom sofa. He told me I had exactly 1 hour to pack my things and leave my own home. I waited for the shock. I waited for the sudden maternal outrage, the fierce sisterly support, or even a basic standard display of human empathy. I stood there taking in the room. If a camera were slowly tracking across this formal sitting room right now, moving deliberately from face to face, it would capture a terrifying masterpiece of absolute apathy. There was no gasp of horror. No one rushed forward to embrace me or offer me a place to sit. The isolation in that room was so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. My mother carefully set her crystal wine glass down on the marble coaster. She did not look at me with pity. She looked at me like I was a muddy footprint ruining her pristine white carpet. "And you just left," my mother asked, her tone dripping with absolute disdain. "You just packed a bag and walked out the door like a defeated, obedient dog." "He kicked me out," I corrected my expression, remaining perfectly neutral. "He moved his mistress in while I was standing right there." "Marcus is a highly successful man," my mother snapped, adjusting her silk robe with a sharp, irritated motion. "He is a pillar of our church community and a provider." Men with that level of power and stress sometimes stray, Chloe. It is the wife's job to anchor the home, to pray through the trials, and to maintain the family image at all costs. Do you have any idea how this will look to the congregation? The annual church charity gala is in exactly 3 weeks. You are going to humiliate us with this scandal. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. Her oldest daughter had just been betrayed in the most degrading, humiliating way possible, and her absolute first concern was the VIP seating chart at a church fundraiser. Nia chimed in, swirling the expensive red wine in her glass with a lazy, deeply jealous smirk. "Mom is right, Chloe. You always worked way too much anyway. You are constantly on your laptop, constantly traveling for those risk management seminars. You probably made Marcus feel completely emasculated in his own home. A man like that needs a woman who knows how to cater to his needs, not a corporate robot who treats him like a business client. You basically pushed him into that young assistant arms." I shifted my cold gaze to my sister. Nia had never built a single thing of her own in her entire life. She married Bradley straight out of college and spent her days maxing out his credit cards while harboring a deep, bitter resentment for anyone who actually worked for a living. She absolutely loved seeing me knocked down, because my supposed failure finally made her feel superior. Then Bradley spoke. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, giving me that intensely condescending, arrogant look that mediocre finance guys perfect in business school. "Look, Chloe, let us be completely logical and strategic here," Bradley said, using the tone one might use to explain basic addition to a slow toddler. "Marcus is a heavy hitter. The guy is managing a massive investment fund. He brings in the kind of capital that keeps this entire family in the upper echelon of Atlanta society. Do you know the kind of yield he brings in? You do not just walk out on a guy who manages 9-figure portfolios because of a little momentary indiscretion." "He kicked me out, Bradley," I repeated, letting the icy edge of my voice sharpen just a fraction. "Because you probably overreacted and bruised his ego?" Bradley scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "You should have stayed calm, negotiated. A nice apology gift like a new car or a diamond, and secured your position as the primary wife. Instead, you packed a bag and ran to mommy." "Marcus is a highly connected individual. He is a rainmaker. You are just a corporate employee. You need him a whole lot more than he needs you. If I were you, I would drive back to Buckhead right now, apologize for causing a scene, and beg him to let you back into that mansion before he officially replaces you on paper." I looked at the three of them, sitting so comfortably in a house that I had secretly helped pay off when my mother was drowning in hidden debt 5 years ago. They had absolutely no idea. They thought Marcus was the glowing sun, and we were all just lucky little planets orbiting his financial brilliance. They worshipped his flashy European cars, his custom-tailored suits, and his arrogant, unearned swagger. They were happily living as parasites, clinging tightly to a host they believed was invincible. They had spent the last decade feasting at a table I secretly funded, all while blindly praising the man who merely carried the plates. You want me to go back and beg a man who was sleeping with his assistant on my sofa to take me back? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. I want you to be smart, my mother said sternly, pointing a manicured finger at me. You are 34 years old, Chloe. You are not getting any younger. If you lose Marcus, you lose everything. You lose the house in Buckhead, you lose your elite social standing, and you lose the immense financial security he provides. I will not have a divorced, destitute daughter living in my guest room and bringing shame to this family. You need to swallow your pride, go back to your husband, and fix this mess you created. Pastor Davis always says a wise woman builds her house, but a foolish one tears it down with her own hands. You are tearing down our legacy. The profound isolation in that room was suffocating. I was entirely surrounded by my own blood, yet I had never been more utterly alone in my entire life. But the isolation did not break me. It liberated me. For years, I had maintained the grand illusion of Marcus' wealth, specifically to protect his fragile ego and to keep the peace within this incredibly toxic status-obsessed family dynamic. I had allowed my mother to boast to her prayer circle about her wealthy son-in-law. I had allowed Bradley to leverage Marcus' name for his own pathetic career advancement. I had played the quiet, supportive background wife so perfectly that they actually believed I was nothing without him. They looked at me with varying degrees of apathy, harsh judgment, and outright contempt. They were actively waiting for me to break down to admit they were right and to scurry back to Marcus with my head bowed in pathetic submission. Instead, I looked at my mother' pristine living room, at Nia's smug face, and at Bradley's arrogant posture. I felt the heavy, immensely satisfying weight of the encrypted black USB drive resting securely in my purse. They were lecturing me about financial security and social survival while I was literally carrying the detonator to their entire economic reality. I did not argue with them. I did not shed a single tear or try to convince them of my worth. Explaining your power to people who are heavily committed to misunderstanding you is a complete waste of breath. I understand perfectly, I said, offering them the exact same chilling, empty smile I had given Marcus just an hour ago. My mother did not like that smile. It was not the tearful submission she was demanding. She sat up straighter in her velvet chair, adjusting her silk robe with a sharp snap of her wrists. She looked at me not with a motherly concern, but with the cold calculation of a socialite managing a public relations crisis. You do not understand anything, Chloe. My mother snapped, her voice dropping into a harsh, reprimanding whisper, as if the church elders were listening at the windows. You are acting like a spoiled child throwing a tantrum because you did not get your way. Let me explain the real world to you. Marcus is a highly successful man. He is a recognized pillar of our church. Do you know how much he donated to the building fund last quarter? He is respected. He is powerful. And let us be completely honest with ourselves here. What man of that stature does not stray sometimes? The sheer toxicity of the words hung in the air, filling the room like suffocating smoke. My own mother was looking me in the eye and validating my husband cheating as if it were a standard tax deduction for the wealthy. You have to endure this to save the family face, she continued, leaning forward and pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my chest. Do you think the women in my generation just packed their bags and ran crying into the night the second their husbands looked at a younger woman? No. We stood our ground. We protected our homes. You turn a blind eye, you prey on it, and you remind him who holds the title of wife. You do not hand over a multi-million-dollar lifestyle to a 23-year-old assistant because your feelings got hurt. You endure it. You endure it because the alternative is being a divorced woman in your mid-30s, starting over with absolutely nothing. Nia nodded vigorously from the love seat, taking another long sip of her red wine. Exactly. You act like you are so perfect, Chloe. But Marcus has been dealing with your cold corporate attitude for a decade. You barely even cook for him. You missed his country club dinner last month because you were at some risk management conference in Seattle. You made him look like a bachelor. If you were actually paying attention to your husband instead of your little spreadsheets, maybe he would not have needed to find comfort in his office. My little spreadsheets. I repeated, my voice deadpan. The absolute absurdity of the situation was almost euphoric. They were entirely convinced that my job as a financial risk director was just a cute little hobby keeping me busy while Marcus conquered the universe. They had no idea those little spreadsheets were the only reason this entire family was not currently drowning in insurmountable debt. Bradley let out a loud, arrogant scoff. He shifted his weight on the sofa, crossing one leg over his knee and swirling the amber liquid in his crystal whiskey glass. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and intense irritation. "Let us cut the emotional nonsense and talk facts," Bradley said, flashing that trademark finance bro smirk. He genuinely believed he was the smartest person in the room. "You deserve to be kicked out, Chloe. You walked in, you caused a scene, and you bruised the ego of a man who is currently playing in the major leagues. You are a liability right now. And frankly, you are threatening my bottom line." I tilted my head slightly, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. "Your bottom line." "Yes, my bottom line," Bradley fired back, leaning forward with aggressive confidence. "Marcus is about to close the acquisition of a massive midtown commercial complex. It is a 9-figure deal, Chloe, the biggest play of his entire career. He is bringing me in on the ground floor. He promised me a partnership stake, and he promised to double the return on your mother retirement portfolio once the acquisition clears. This deal is going to bring millions to me and your mother. Millions." He took a slow, deliberate sip of his whiskey, relishing the taste of his imaginary future wealth. "You are just a wage earner," Chloe Bradley continued, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. "You collect a nice little paycheck every 2 weeks, and you get a corporate bonus at Christmas. That is cute, but Marcus is building generational wealth. He is securing the future of this entire family. We are talking about elite commercial real estate. So do not come in here with your hurt feelings and your single suitcase trying to ruin our cash cow. You need to get back in your car, drive back to Buckhead, and apologize to the man who is keeping all of us relevant." I stood perfectly still, letting his words echo through the immaculate sitting room. A midtown commercial complex. A 9-figure deal. He was talking about the towering glass and steel architecture of the Midtown Plaza. He was talking about the exact commercial property acquisition that had been sitting on my desk for the past 3 weeks. Marcus had been bragging to my family. He had been promising them millions and guaranteeing them partnership stakes in a deal he thought he was brilliantly orchestrating. He had sold them a dream of unlimited wealth, painting himself as the mastermind of the entire operation. But Marcus was not the mastermind. Marcus was the middleman. His investment firm was merely submitting a bid to purchase that complex, and the entity selling that complex, the entity holding the absolute final say on whether Marcus' bid was accepted or rejected, that was Apex Capital, the parent corporation that I had built from the ground up, the corporation where I served as the anonymous chief executive officer. Marcus was using my company pending acquisition to manipulate my family into worshiping him. He was promising them pieces of a pie he did not even own yet. And the true irony, the absolute cinematic perfection of this moment, was that the final signature required to approve Marcus' acquisition was mine. I looked at my mother, who was staring at me with a mixture of anger and desperate greed. She was willing to sell her oldest daughter dignity for a promised return on a retirement portfolio that I had already secretly replenished for her years ago. She was willing to force me to share a house with my husband, 23-year-old mistress, just so she could keep bragging to her church friends about her wealthy son-in-law. I looked at Nia, who was grinning maliciously, thrilled that the perfect older sister was finally being put in her place. She was happily riding the coattails of her arrogant husband, blindly trusting a financial future built on Marcus' lies. And then I looked at Bradley. Bradley, who sat there swirling his whiskey, completely intoxicated by the illusion of millions of dollars that would never materialize. He was a small man trying to play a big game, and he had bet his entire existence on a man who was nothing more than a fraud. "You really think Marcus is going to close that Midtown deal?" I asked, my voice perfectly smooth, betraying absolutely none of the lethal information I held. "I do not think it." "Chloe, I know it," Bradley snapped back, rolling his eyes, as if my question was the stupidest thing he had ever heard. The capital is secured. The term sheets are drafted. The parent company is ready to sign. He is a lock. You do not understand how these high-level acquisitions work because you just manage corporate risk. This is aggressive expansion. This is how real money is made. So do us all a favor and stop acting like a victim. Go fix your marriage before you cost this family everything. My mother stood up, smoothing down her silk robe. You heard him, Chloe. I will not let your stubbornness destroy what Marcus is building for us. You leave that suitcase right there by the door. You are going to march back out to your car, drive home, and you are going to make it right. If you have to sleep in the guest room for a few weeks until he gets tired of that young girl, then so be it. That is the price of keeping a man of his caliber. The gaslighting was masterful. It was a flawless, coordinated psychological attack designed to strip away my reality and replace it with their transactional, warped version of the world. They wanted me broken, obedient, and financially subservient. They wanted me to be the sacrificial lamb on the altar of Marcus' ego. But they had drastically miscalculated. They were trying to gaslight a woman who held the receipts for every single lie they had ever been told. They were trying to manipulate a woman who had the encryption key to their entire financial universe, sitting quietly in her designer handbag. I did not argue. I did not try to explain the truth about the Midtown complex. Giving them a warning would completely ruin the execution. You do not tell your enemies that the bridge is rigged with explosives while they are still walking across it. You just smile and wait for them to reach the center. I looked at the three of them, capturing this exact moment in my memory. This was the last time I would ever view them as my family. From this second forward, they were simply collateral damage. You are absolutely right, I said, my voice soft, accommodating, and perfectly deceptive. I should not ruin the cash cow. Bradley smirked, raising his glass toward me in a mock toast. Glad to see you finally coming to your senses. It is just business, Chloe. Do not take it personally. Oh, I assure you, Bradley, I replied, turning toward the heavy oak front door and reaching for the handle of my suitcase. I am handling this strictly as a business transaction. I turned the heavy brass handle of the front door and stepped out onto the wraparound porch, leaving my mother, my sister, and my arrogant brother-in-law sitting in their pristine little bubble of delusion. The sky had finally broken open, unleashing a torrential Atlanta downpour. It was as if the city itself was washing away the final lingering threads of my suffocating past. Behind me, the heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing them inside. I did not look back. I did not pause to wipe the cold rain from my face. I simply gripped the handle of my small black suitcase and walked directly into the storm. They had just shown me exactly who they were. They were not a family. They were a business syndicate disguised by Sunday church hats and fake smiles. They worshipped at the altar of money and status, sacrificing their own blood to protect a man who had brought a 23-year-old mistress into his marital bed. They were willing to force me back into a deeply humiliating situation just to secure their imaginary payout. My mother wanted her retirement portfolio doubled. Bradley wanted his partnership stake. Nia wanted her endless shopping sprees funded. They had all banded together to protect the goose that laid the golden eggs. They simply had no idea they were betting their entire futures on a mirage. I loaded my wet suitcase into the trunk of my car and slid into the driver's seat. The leather interior was quiet and insulated, blocking out the harsh pounding of the rain against the roof. As I merged onto the highway, heading straight toward the glowing skyline of downtown Atlanta, I let Bradley's ignorant words echo in my mind. A 9-figure deal. The biggest play of his entire career. Generational wealth. It took every ounce of my willpower not to burst into uncontrollable laughter right there in the car. Bradley actually thought Marcus was a shark swimming in the deep end of the financial ocean. He thought Marcus was orchestrating a massive commercial real estate acquisition that would cement his legacy in the city. What Bradley did not know was that in the world of high-level commercial acquisitions, the loudest men in the room are rarely the ones writing the checks. Marcus was a front. His investment firm was flashy and highly visible, making him the perfect face for high-profile bids. But behind every major bid is a parent company holding the actual capital, providing the real leverage and holding the absolute final authority to execute or kill a deal. Marcus' firm had submitted a highly aggressive bid to purchase the Midtown Plaza complex. He had leveraged everything he had, including the equity in our Buckhead mansion and the retirement funds of naive investors like my mother and Bradley, just to secure his position at the negotiating table. He thought he was brilliant. He thought the deal was an absolute lock. The highway gave way to the sleek, towering architecture of the business district. I bypassed the luxury hotels and the upscale residential buildings where a typical discarded wife might seek refuge for the night. I did not need a hotel room. I needed my command center. I steered my car toward a towering skyscraper of dark-tinted glass and steel. It was one of the most imposing structures in the Atlanta skyline, piercing the storm clouds like a massive, sleek monolith. I drove down the private ramp into the VIP underground parking garage. There were no ticket machines or attendants here. I rolled down my window and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner panel. The light flashed green instantly, and the heavy steel security gate rolled smoothly open. I parked in my dedicated reserved spot near the private executive elevator. The rain had soaked my clothes and ruined my hair, but as I stepped out of the car, I had never felt more incredibly powerful. I swiped my key card in the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse level. The ascent was silent and fast, a physical elevation that matched my soaring mental clarity. The doors slid open, revealing an expansive, breathtaking office lobby. The floors were polished black marble, reflecting the ambient lighting like a dark mirror. Mounted on the wall directly in front of the elevator doors were two massive brushed steel words illuminated by a sharp white backlight: Apex Capital. I walked past the empty reception desk and pushed open the frosted glass doors of the primary corner office. The room was massive, surrounded on three sides by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic, commanding view of the entire city. I walked over to the glass, looking out at the rain-slicked streets below. Standing tall and proud in the distance, right in the heart of the glowing city, was the Midtown Plaza commercial complex. It was a beautiful piece of prime real estate spanning multiple city blocks. It was the exact complex Marcus was currently popping champagne over, believing he was about to own it. But Marcus did not own it. Marcus was begging to buy it, and he was begging to buy it from me. Apex Capital was the parent corporation that owned exactly 80% of the Midtown Plaza, and I was the anonymous founder and chief executive officer of Apex Capital. For 7 years, I had built this financial empire in total, absolute secrecy. I used layers of corporate attorneys, ironclad non-disclosure agreements, and offshore holding entities to ensure my name never appeared on a single public-facing document. I had created a financial fortress so secure that my own husband, a man who fancied himself an investment genius, had no idea his entire livelihood was entirely dependent on my corporate approval. While he was out buying flashy cars and entertaining young assistants, I was quietly acquiring city blocks. He had brought his lover into my home. He had kicked me out into the street. My family had told me to swallow my pride and bow down to his greatness so they could get their payout. They all thought they had completely outplayed a simple risk management director. They thought they had backed the winning side of a very ugly divorce. I walked over to my massive custom mahogany desk and dropped my wet purse onto the leather blotter. I unzipped the inner pocket and pulled out the encrypted black USB drive I had taken from Marcus' wall safe. I placed it gently next to my keyboard. The drive contained every single piece of evidence I needed to freeze his accounts, block his funding, and expose his fraudulent use of investor capital. The game was no longer about saving a marriage or maintaining a fake family image. The game was now about absolute financial annihilation. Tomorrow morning, the undisputed king of Atlanta was going to wake up and realize his crown was made of paper and I was holding a lit match. I sat back in my custom leather executive chair, letting the soft hum of the penthouse climate control system wash over me. Outside, the Atlanta storm continued to batter the floor-to-ceiling windows, with lightning briefly illuminating the midtown skyline. But inside my office, Everything was perfectly still and entirely under my command. I reached across the expanse of my dark mahogany desk and picked up the matte black USB drive. It was cold, sleek, and visually unassuming. To anyone else, it was just a standard piece of office equipment. To Marcus, it was the heavily guarded vault of his corporate secrets. To me, it was the digital leash I had kept around his neck for nearly a decade. I slid the drive into the secure terminal built into the surface of my desk. Instantly, my 3 curved monitors woke from their sleep state. A stark black command prompt appeared requiring a biometric scan and a 25-character encryption key. I pressed my thumb to the scanner and typed the master password with rapid muscle memory. The screen flashed a brilliant green. Decryption successful. Lines of code and heavily encrypted file directories began cascading down the screens. It was a digital waterfall of Marcus' financial existence. I opened the master ledger, expanding the view so it filled my entire field of vision. This was not just a spreadsheet. It was a perfectly detailed map of a man's enormous, unearned ego. To the outside world, Marcus was a self-made titan of the Atlanta wealth management sector. He was the brilliant managing partner of Sterling Vanguard Investments, featured in business magazines and highly respected by the elite financial circles of the South. He gave seminars on aggressive growth strategies and aggressive market capitalization. He wore his success like a crown, demanding absolute respect from his peers, his congregation, and his family. But looking at the raw data populating my screens, the truth was starkly, hilariously different. Marcus was a financial fiction. He was a hologram projected by my money. 7 years ago, Marcus was a desperate junior broker who had made a catastrophically arrogant margin call. He had over-leveraged his entire portfolio and was staring down the barrel of personal and professional bankruptcy. I remember the exact night he realized he was ruined. He sat on the floor of our starter townhouse, crying into his hands, terrified of losing his license and his precious social standing. He begged me for help. He begged me to fix it. I did fix it, but I knew exactly who I was married to. I knew that if I simply handed him the money as his wife, his fragile pride would eventually curdle into deep resentment. He could never love a woman who had to save him from his own stupidity. So I saved him from the shadows. Using my deep expertise in corporate risk management and financial architecture, I established my first offshore shell company. I routed my own rapidly growing corporate bonuses and private investment yields through a labyrinth of blind trusts and proxy legal representatives. Then I had one of my proxy attorneys approach Marcus with a highly lucrative anonymous angel investment. The capital injection saved his firm overnight. The transformation in Marcus was instantaneous and nauseating. The very next day he came home, puffed out his chest, and told me he had brilliantly negotiated a miracle deal with a reclusive billionaire syndicate. He took absolute total credit for saving himself. He never once suspected that the anonymous billionaire syndicate saving his career was the woman cooking his dinner in the next room. From that moment on, I became the invisible architect of his entire career. Whenever Sterling Vanguard needed a massive capital injection to close a high-profile deal, my shell companies provided the liquidity. Whenever he needed to show massive quarterly growth to attract new local investors, my entities manufactured the necessary trade volume. I created a web of subsidiaries with intimidating corporate names like Orion Holdings and Vanguard Trust. Marcus spent his days whining and dining proxy lawyers, desperately trying to impress them with his financial acumen. He would come home and brag to me about how he had masterfully manipulated these corporate giants into backing his plays. He had no idea that those lawyers reported directly to me every single Friday at 4 in the afternoon. He had no idea that I had already approved the term sheets hours before he even walked into the boardroom to aggressively negotiate them. I gave him the playground, the toys, and the rulebook. All he did was show up and take the credit. As the data continued to render across my screens, I opened the specific directory labeling his current operational capital. The deeper he got into my pockets over the years, the more unbearable his arrogance became. As his fake wealth grew, he began treating me less like a partner and more like a subordinate. He told his country club friends he was the sole provider for our household. He let my mother and my sister believe he was carrying me financially. He built a massive, fragile glass castle and threw rocks at me from the highest balcony, entirely unaware that I owned the land, the glass, the rocks, and the very air he was breathing. I scrolled through the routing numbers, matching them against my own internal Apex Capital ledgers. Every single transfer matched perfectly. He was pulling a management fee off the top of my money and using it to buy custom suits, luxury cars, and evidently 23-year-old assistants. He was using the allowance I secretly gave him to fund his infidelity and to buy the loyalty of my greedy status-obsessed family. The sheer audacity of his illusion was almost impressive. But an illusion only lasts as long as the projector remains plugged in. I highlighted the primary funding nodes connecting his firm to my offshore accounts. With a few keystrokes, I could sever the digital arteries that kept his entire firm breathing. He thought he was untouchable because his name was on the door. He was just an arrogant puppet performing a play I had written, and he had completely forgotten to look up at the strings. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes narrowing as I moved past the historical data, and opened the folders containing his transactions from the last 30 days. I needed to see exactly how reckless he had become since bringing Jasmine into the picture. A puppet who forgets his place is dangerous, but a puppet who starts stealing from the audience is a dead man walking. I clicked open the master transaction log for his private executive accounts, ready to trace exactly where he was bleeding capital to fund his new lifestyle. What I saw on the screen made my blood turn to absolute ice, and my slow, cold smile widen into a genuine promise of destruction. The screen illuminated the dark office with a harsh white glare, casting sharp shadows across my face. I leaned closer to the monitor, my fingers flying across the keyboard to isolate a series of highly irregular wire transfers. Marcus had always been remarkably arrogant, but I had always assumed he possessed a basic level of self-preservation. I had assumed he was simply skimming his management fees to fund his midlife crisis and buy expensive dinners for his new 23-year-old assistant. But the transaction logs staring back at me revealed a level of reckless stupidity that bordered on the spectacular. He was not just skimming off the top of his operational budget. He was actively and blatantly embezzling client funds. I opened a heavily encrypted subfolder labeled Private Wealth Management. There, highlighted in glaring red text, was an account registered to my mother. This was the sacred retirement portfolio she had bragged about at every church luncheon and family gathering for the past 3 years. This was the portfolio she had proudly handed over to Marcus because she firmly believed her brilliant son-in-law would double her yield and secure her status among the Atlanta elite. I traced the transaction history over the last 45 days. The balance had plummeted from a very comfortable $500,000 to practically zero. Marcus had completely liquidated her blue-chip stocks and initiated a massive wire transfer to an untraceable private checking account. I followed that routing number through the digital maze. The destination was not an aggressive growth fund or a secure real estate escrow. The destination was a high-end diamond boutique located in the absolute heart of Buckhead. He had taken my mother's entire financial safety net, the money she intended to use to maintain her pristine social standing for the rest of her life, and he had converted it into a custom pear-shaped diamond tennis bracelet and a matching pendant for Jasmine. The absolute poetic justice of it all washed over me in a chilling wave. Just an hour ago, my mother had stood in her immaculate living room pointing a manicured finger at me and demanding I endure my husband's infidelity to protect her precious retirement returns. She had told me to swallow my pride and accept a mistress in my home because Marcus was the golden goose keeping our family relevant. She had no idea the goose had already been slaughtered and served to a girl barely out of college. My mother had sold her oldest daughter dignity to protect a bank account that had already been drained to buy diamonds for the very woman who had destroyed my marriage. But Marcus was not finished digging his own grave. I scrolled down to the next major unauthorized withdrawal on the ledger. This one was tied to a custodial trust account. I clicked on the beneficiary details and saw the name of my nephew. It was Bradley, 5-year-old son. Bradley, the arrogant finance bro who had stood in my mother house swirling his whiskey and calling me a mere wage earner. Bradley had entrusted Marcus with a massive six-figure college and investment fund, believing he was getting in on the ground floor of an elite wealth-building strategy. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game with the big boys. I traced the outflow from that specific trust. Marcus had authorized a complete withdrawal under the guise of an emergency portfolio reallocation. I tracked the digital footprint of those funds as they moved out of the trust and into a secondary holding account. They did not go into a commercial real estate venture. They went straight to a luxury bridal jeweler in New York City. Bradley's arrogant dreams of generational wealth and his son's entire educational future had just purchased a flawless 5-carat diamond engagement ring for Jasmine. Marcus was not just moving her into my house today. He was planning to propose to her using money stolen directly from his arrogant brother-in-law. I sat back in my heavy leather executive chair, letting the sheer magnitude of their collective stupidity sink in. Bradley had looked me dead in the eye and told me not to ruin the family cash cow. He had lectured me about high-level acquisitions and aggressive market expansion. He thought he was a shark swimming in the deep end of the financial ocean, completely oblivious to the fact that his own brother-in-law had just robbed his child blind to finance an illicit affair. They were all so blinded by the shiny illusion of Marcus' wealth that they had willingly handed him the keys to their own destruction. They had eagerly thrown me to the wolves to protect a man who was actively bleeding them dry. If there were a camera capturing this exact moment, it would push in slowly, zooming tight on my eyes, reflected in the harsh glow of the computer monitors. The initial shock of the betrayal and the burning anger that had fueled my drive downtown completely evaporated into the cool air of the penthouse. What replaced it was something far more dangerous. My anger morphed into a slow, cold, highly calculated smile. Marcus was no longer just a cheating husband with an inflated ego and a penchant for young assistants. He was a federal criminal who had committed massive wire fraud and blatant embezzlement. He had crossed the definitive line from marital betrayal into grand larceny and severe violations of the Securities and Exchange Commission regulations. He was going to federal prison, and my family was going to end up completely destitute. They had tied their entire existence to a sinking ship, and I was the only person holding a life raft. But I had absolutely no intention of throwing it to them. I placed my hands flat on the smooth mahogany surface of my desk. It was time to pull the net tight. I had built the digital infrastructure of his life, and now I was going to systematically dismantle it piece by piece. I opened the master control panel for Apex Capital and began drafting the digital kill commands. I targeted the credit cards, the utility accounts, the routing numbers, and the specific investment nodes that kept his firm operational. With a few precise keystrokes, I set the execution timers for exactly 8 in the morning. Tomorrow, Marcus would wake up believing he was a king about to close the biggest commercial real estate deal of his life. My mother would wake up believing her retirement was secure and her social status was untouchable. Bradley would wake up believing he was a financial genius on the verge of a multi-million-dollar partnership. I was going to let them put on their best clothes, smile their fake smiles, and walk right into the most spectacular public execution this city had ever seen. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the countdown had officially begun. The digital kill commands were locked and loaded for 8 in the morning, but my work for the night was not quite finished. I shifted my attention away from the glaring red alerts of Marcus' massive embezzlement and opened a new secure window on my center monitor. The trap was set for his liquid assets, but I needed to address the physical ground he was currently standing on. I needed to dismantle his absolute favorite monument to his own arrogance. Marcus had stood in the grand foyer of our Buckhead mansion, puffed out his chest, and proudly declared that the house was in his company name. He had used that technicality as a weapon to kick me out into the night, believing it gave him supreme, unshakable authority over my living situation. He had paraded his 23-year-old assistant through the custom mahogany doors like a king, welcoming his new queen into a fortress. It was a beautiful narrative for a man utterly obsessed with his own reflection. But just like his investment portfolio, His real estate holdings were nothing more than a highly leveraged house of cards, waiting for a strong gust of wind. I accessed the private commercial real estate database used exclusively by elite institutional investors. I typed in the address of the Buckhead Mansion, the exact property I had spent months meticulously designing, furnishing, and transforming into a showcase of upper-class Atlanta elegance. The property deed populated on my screen, followed immediately by the complex labyrinth of its financing history. Marcus was technically correct about one thing. The deed was registered to a subsidiary LLC under his investment firm. But what he conveniently left out of his arrogant speech was the fact that the property was mortgaged to the absolute hilt. 3 years ago, when he was desperately trying to project an image of massive corporate growth to attract new, naive investors like my brother-in-law Bradley, he had taken out a predatory commercial balloon mortgage against the estate. He had used the house as collateral to secure a high-risk line of credit from a mid-tier commercial lender called Georgia Heritage Bank. It was a reckless amateur move that any competent risk manager would have flagged immediately. I smiled as I reviewed the strict covenants embedded in his loan agreement. Commercial mortgages are not like residential home loans, they are ruthless. They contain aggressive acceleration clauses and cross-default provisions. If the borrower misses a single payment, or if the underlying corporate guarantor exhibits signs of severe financial instability, the lender possesses the absolute legal right to demand the entire principal balance immediately. If the borrower cannot produce the millions of dollars in cash on demand, the lender can seize the property with terrifying speed. Marcus had barely been making the minimum interest payments for the last 6 months. In fact, his most recent payment had only cleared because he had secretly cannibalized the funds he stole from my mother's retirement account. He was treating the mansion like a giant ATM, and Georgia Heritage Bank was already flagging the account for high-risk monitoring. I reached across my desk and pressed the intercom button connecting directly to the overnight acquisitions director for Apex Capital. It was nearly 2 in the morning, but in the world of global finance, money never actually sleeps. The director answered on the first ring, his voice crisp and immediately attentive. I gave him a very specific, highly prioritized directive. I instructed him to contact the executive vice president of Georgia Heritage Bank and authorize the immediate cash purchase of a specific distressed debt portfolio. I gave him the exact loan identification number for the Buckhead Mansion. When Apex Capital, the multi-billion-dollar parent corporation that dominated the Atlanta commercial real estate market, offers to buy a high-risk toxic loan off a mid-tier bank balance sheet at a slight premium, the transaction happens with lightning speed. The bank executives were likely waking up in their beds, approving the digital transfer with eager, trembling hands, thrilled to offload a risky asset to a corporate giant. I sat back and watched the digital progress bar on my monitor. Within 25 minutes, the wire transfer cleared the Federal Reserve overnight processing system. The digital ink dried on the assignment of the deed of trust. I watched the ownership registry of the debt officially update in the secured database. It was done. Apex Capital was now the sole unquestionable owner of the commercial mortgage tied to the Buckhead Mansion. And since I was the sole proprietor and anonymous chief executive officer of Apex Capital, I was now officially Marcus' legal creditor. I literally owned the roof over his cheating head. But owning the debt was only the first phase of the operation. The execution was where the true artistry lived. I opened my legal software suite and pulled up the standard corporate templates for commercial foreclosure and immediate asset seizure. Because Marcus had breached the core covenants of the loan agreement by engaging in fraudulent wire transfers and failing to maintain the required liquidity ratios, the loan was officially in catastrophic default. I did not need to wait for a 30-day grace period. I did not need to send a polite warning letter. I had the absolute legal authority to accelerate the loan and initiate an immediate hostile foreclosure. My fingers flew across the keyboard, filling in the legal blanks with surgical precision. I typed in his full legal name. I typed in the name of his fraudulent investment firm. I typed in the exact address of the mansion where he was currently sleeping soundly next to Jasmine. I clearly cited the specific contractual violations, the financial insolvency, and the immediate demand for the full repayment of the multi-million-dollar principal balance by standard close of business. Knowing full well he possessed absolutely zero liquid capital to satisfy the demand, I generated the subsequent legal order. It was a formal notice of default foreclosure and immediate eviction. The language was cold, uncompromising, and legally bulletproof. It stated that the premises must be fully vacated and surrendered to the creditor. I applied my secure digital executive signature to the bottom of the document, validating it with the full corporate weight of Apex Capital. I then routed the documents directly to our retained crisis management legal firm with strict instructions for delivery. I did not want this notice sent quietly through the standard postal service. I did not want it slipped casually under the front doormat. I ordered a specialized corporate process server, flanked by 2 armed off-duty Fulton County Sheriff deputies, to personally deliver the documents directly into Marcus' hands. I scheduled the delivery for exactly 9 in the morning. I wanted to give him just enough time to wake up, discover his credit cards were completely dead, and experience the rising panic of his frozen bank accounts before the heavy knock of the law echoed through the grand foyer. I pictured Jasmine waking up in the custom California king bed, stretching her arms and smiling at the luxurious ceiling. She honestly thought she had hit the ultimate jackpot. She thought she had successfully stolen a wealthy, powerful man and secured her place in Atlanta elite high society. She believed she was waking up as the queen of a beautiful, untouchable castle. She had absolutely no idea that she was actually waking up as a legal trespasser inside a foreclosed corporate asset. She thought she was moving into my house. Tomorrow morning she was going to be thrown out onto the manicured lawn holding her cheap bags while the bank changed the locks on the heavy mahogany front doors. Marcus had given me exactly 1 hour to pack my things. I was going to give him the exact same courtesy, but I was going to do it with armed guards watching his every move. The profound irony of the situation settled deep into my bones, bringing a wave of absolute peace. My family had demanded I endure his infidelity to protect a house that was essentially made of quicksand. They had told me I would be destitute and homeless if I did not bow down to his massive financial power. They were all completely blind to the fact that I was the one controlling the weather in their little universe. I looked at the clock on my monitors. It was approaching 3 in the morning. The digital kill commands for his firm were locked. The embezzlement evidence was perfectly compiled and secured. The legal foreclosure and eviction orders were officially dispatched. The trap was not just set, it was fully armed and ticking down to 0. I powered down the massive monitors, plunging the corner office back into the soft ambient shadows of the city lights. I picked up my small black suitcase and walked toward the private executive resting suite attached to my office. I lay down on the plush modern sofa, closing my eyes with a deep, satisfying breath. The storm was currently raging outside the glass walls of the skyscraper, but my mind had never been clearer. Tomorrow the sun would rise over Atlanta, and the magnificent, spectacular destruction of Marcus would finally begin. Day 3 of my absence from the Buckhead mansion arrived with the crisp clarity of a perfectly executed plan. For the past 72 hours, I had operated in a state of absolute focus, directing my legal team and finalizing the complex financial maneuvers required to sever Marcus entirely from my corporate ecosystem. I had not slept much, but I had never felt more energized. The silence from his end had been expected. He was likely too busy playing house with Jasmine, treating my absence as a minor inconvenience that would eventually resolve itself when I supposedly came to my senses. He was enjoying his temporary illusion of victory, but illusions have an expiration date, and his was set for exactly 8 in the morning. I sat in my penthouse office at Apex Capital, a steaming cup of artisan coffee resting on my desk. The skyline of Atlanta stretched out before me, bathed in the morning light. I opened my primary dashboard, monitoring the real-time status of the kill commands I had initiated the night before. At exactly 8 o'clock, the digital indicators on my screen shifted from green to a solid, definitive red. The master connection to his investment firm was severed. The corporate credit accounts guaranteed by my assets were locked. The utility services for the Buckhead mansion were scheduled for disconnection. The financial guillotine had officially dropped. Now all I had to do was wait for the impact. I knew Marcus' schedule intimately. On Thursday mornings, he typically liked to project an image of effortless success. He would often close a minor deal or take a client out for an expensive breakfast to reinforce his status. Today, however, I knew exactly what he was doing. According to the surveillance I had quietly maintained on his calendar, he had scheduled a VIP appointment at the premier Porsche dealership in Buckhead. He was taking Jasmine to pick out her new car. It was the ultimate display of arrogance, the final insult he thought he was delivering to a wife he believed he had easily discarded. He was going to buy his mistress a luxury vehicle using the very accounts I had just frozen. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee and visualizing the scene unfolding at the dealership. I could picture it perfectly. Marcus walking into the gleaming showroom, his chest puffed out, wearing one of his custom-tailored suits. Jasmine clinging to his arm, looking at the sleek sports cars with wide, greedy eyes. They would be treated like royalty by the sales staff, offered espresso, and ushered into the VIP lounge to finalize the paperwork. Marcus would lean back in the leather chair, crossing his legs, and casually hand over his black corporate card to cover the massive down payment. He would wait for the respectful nod from the finance manager, the confirmation of his supreme purchasing power. But that nod was never going to come. I watched the clock on my monitor tick past 10:30. Right on schedule, the first notification pinged on my phone. It was an automated alert from the credit card processor attempting to authorize a transaction for $120,000 at the Porsche dealership. The status line below the amount read, "Transaction declined, account frozen." I smiled, a slow, satisfying smile that reached all the way to my eyes. The first domino had officially fallen. I could imagine the exact sequence of events happening in that VIP lounge. The finance manager would return looking apologetic and slightly embarrassed, murmuring something about a technical glitch or a security hold. Marcus would scoff, wave his hand dismissively, and hand over a different card, perhaps his personal platinum card or the secondary corporate account. But every single piece of plastic in his expensive leather wallet was tied to the same central node I had just completely dismantled. Every swipe would return the exact same humiliating result: declined. The realization would hit him, not all at once, but in a slow, creeping wave of dread. He would try to call his banking representative, demanding to know why his accounts were suddenly locked. He would be met with polite confusion and a suggestion to contact the primary account holder. The primary account holder, who was currently sitting in a skyscraper, holding the keys to his entire existence. At 10:45, my personal cell phone began to vibrate on the desk. The caller ID flashed brightly across the screen. Marcus. I did not reach for it. I simply watched it vibrate, the soft buzzing sound echoing in the quiet office. He was calling to demand answers, to yell at me for interfering with his accounts, or perhaps to arrogantly order me to fix the so-called glitch. He still did not understand the magnitude of his situation. He thought this was a minor technicality, a petty revenge tactic from a scorned wife that he could easily bully his way out of. The phone stopped vibrating. 10 seconds later, it started again. And then again. I took another sip of my coffee, letting the rich, dark flavor settle on my tongue. Over the next hour, the phone lit up incessantly. Marcus called 15 times in rapid succession. When I did not answer, he switched to text messages. The notifications cascaded down my lock screen, painting a vivid picture of his escalating panic. "What the hell did you do to the accounts? Fix this right now, Chloe. I am at the dealership. Do not play games." Chloe answered the phone. "This is not funny. Call the bank and authorize the transaction immediately, or I swear to God." The threats were empty, hollow words from a man who was rapidly discovering he had absolutely no leverage. He was standing in a luxury dealership with his 23-year-old mistress, looking like an absolute fool. The facade of the wealthy, untouchable titan was cracking in real time in front of strangers. The humiliation would be visceral, and it was exactly what he deserved. By noon, the missed call count had reached 45. The text messages had shifted from arrogant demands to frantic, confused pleas. He was finally starting to realize that this was not a glitch. He was starting to realize that the accounts were not just locked, they were systematically dismantled. He had probably tried to log into his investment firm portals only to find his access completely revoked. He was grasping at thin air, trying to find a solid surface in a world that I had just fundamentally destabilized. I picked up my phone and swiped away the notifications, clearing the screen with a single decisive motion. I had no intention of answering him. Answering would give him a target. Answering would allow him to channel his panic into an argument. Silence was far more terrifying. Silence meant he had to sit alone with the horrifying realization that his entire life was imploding, and he had absolutely no idea how to stop it. The silence also served a strategic purpose. It gave the next phase of the operation time to execute perfectly, while he was frantically trying to figure out why his credit cards were declining. The legal machinery I had set in motion the night before was quietly moving into position. The armed process server and the Fulton County Sheriff deputies were currently en route to the Buckhead mansion, carrying the formal eviction notice. Marcus was about to leave the dealership completely humiliated and empty-handed. He would likely rush back to the house, desperately trying to figure out how to access his emergency cash or contact his lawyers. He would expect to find his sanctuary waiting for him. He would expect to walk through those heavy mahogany doors and formulate a plan to regain control. But control was a luxury he would never possess again. I sat back in my chair watching the skyline and waiting for the final devastating blow to land. The king was currently realizing his crown was fake. In exactly 30 minutes, he was going to find out his castle belonged to me. I knew exactly where Marcus would go next. His fragile ego could not handle being humiliated in front of Jasmine and a room full of luxury car salesmen. He needed a target. He desperately needed someone to scream at so he could regain his false sense of authority. Since I was completely ignoring his frantic phone calls, he would seek out a physical confrontation. He would drive his expensive car straight to the corporate risk management firm, where he firmly believed I spent my days crunching numbers for a modest salary. I had maintained a wonderful relationship with my former colleagues. The head receptionist at my old firm was a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane. She had texted me 20 minutes ago, letting me know that Marcus had just stormed through their revolving glass doors. I could picture the entire pathetic scene with absolute clarity. Marcus marching across the polished marble lobby, his face flushed with rage, leaving Jasmine waiting out in the car. He would bypass the visitor seating and march directly to the front desk, demanding to see the director of financial risk management. He would slam his hand on the marble counter, projecting the aura of a powerful executive whose wife had just thrown a petty tantrum with his bank accounts. "Tell my wife to get down here right now," he barked at Diane. "Tell Chloe her husband is waiting, and I am not leaving until she fixes the mess she just made with my corporate cards." Diane, a professional who did not tolerate arrogance from anyone, simply looked at him with genuine confusion. She checked her corporate directory, even though she knew perfectly well what the answer was. "I am sorry, sir," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet lobby. "There must be some mistake. Miss Chloe does not work here." Marcus scoffed, leaning over the counter trying to intimidate her, using his physical size. "Do not play games with me. She is your risk management director. Go get her right now." Diane did not flinch. She looked him dead in the eye. "Sir, I assure you I am not playing games. Ms. Chloe resigned as director 2 years ago, sir. We threw her a farewell party. She has not worked in this building for 24 months. The absolute shock that hit his system in that exact moment was something I deeply wished I could have witnessed in person. 2 years. For 730 days, he had kissed me goodbye in the morning, asked me how my little spreadsheets were going, and half listened to me talk about office politics. For 2 entire years, he firmly believed I was driving to that building while he played the role of the primary breadwinner. He had completely ignored my life so thoroughly that he had zero idea where I had actually been going every single day. His brain scrambled trying to compute the massive gaping hole in his reality. If she did not work here, where had she been going? Where was her paycheck coming from? Who was he actually married to? He was utterly bewildered, standing in a lobby he had no business being in, realizing he knew absolutely nothing about the woman he had just kicked out of his house. As he stood frozen in the lobby of a company I had long outgrown, the final trap card I had prepared was delivered directly to his pocket. I sat in my penthouse suite at Apex Capital, watching the delivery confirmation from the corporate process server. I picked up my phone, opened our text thread, which was heavily clogged with his dozens of desperate demands, and attached a single high-resolution photograph. It was not a picture of me. It was not a long, emotional paragraph explaining my feelings. It was a crisp, perfectly framed image of the official foreclosure notice and order of immediate eviction. The document featured the bold, imposing seal of Apex Capital right at the top. Below the corporate seal, his full legal name was printed clearly as the defaulting debtor. The property listed was our Buckhead mansion, and the vacant date was printed in heavy red ink demanding the absolute surrender of the premises by 9 in the morning tomorrow. I typed a short message to accompany the image. My fingers tapped the screen with the calm precision of an executioner pulling a final lever. I didn't take anything of yours, Marcus. I'm just reclaiming what you owe my company. I hit send. I watched the delivery receipt change to read. His phone buzzed in his hand right as he stood in that lobby, completely unmoored from his reality. I knew he would open the message instantly, expecting an apology or an explanation for the frozen credit cards. Instead, he saw a legal death warrant for his entire lifestyle. He would read the bold text of the legal document. He would read the words Apex Capital, the very same parent corporation he had been desperately trying to impress for the massive Midtown Plaza acquisition. The very same multi-billion-dollar syndicate he had promised my mother and my brother-in-law would make him endlessly wealthy. The gears in his head would grind and spark as they finally locked into place. The frozen bank accounts, the declined credit cards at the Porsche dealership, the wife who had secretly resigned from her corporate job 2 years ago, the foreclosure notice bearing the name of the most powerful commercial real estate holding company in Atlanta. He would finally understand the sheer, terrifying magnitude of his mistake. He did not just cheat on a corporate wage earner. He brought a 23-year-old assistant into a house owned by a corporate titan and tried to kick out the actual landlord. The panic he felt at the car dealership would seem like a gentle breeze compared to the Category 5 hurricane currently tearing through his nervous system. His castle was gone. His money was gone. His secret financial backer had vanished into thin air. And his new mistress was currently sitting in the passenger seat of a car he could no longer afford, expecting to be driven back to a mansion she was legally barred from entering. He was standing completely naked in the financial world, and I was the one who had just turned a massive spotlight on him. All those years he spent parading around Buckhead acting like he was the smartest man in the room were over. He was a fraud who had just been forcefully evicted from his own illusion. I locked my phone and set it face down on my mahogany desk. The swift and total destruction of Marcus was proceeding flawlessly, but the true masterpiece of this operation was yet to come. He was just the first casualty. My family, who had so eagerly thrown me to the wolves to protect his imaginary wealth, was next on the agenda. I watched the delivery confirmation on my screen. Knowing Marcus was currently standing in the lobby of my former employer, his entire false reality crumbling around him. The silence in my office was absolute, a perfect reflection of the control I now possessed. But the financial shockwaves I had generated were not just hitting Marcus. They were rippling outward, striking the greedy, opportunistic parasites who had attached themselves to his sinking ship. My personal cell phone vibrated against the mahogany desk. I glanced at the caller identification. It was not Marcus making his 46th desperate attempt to reach me. It was Bradley, my arrogant fleece vest-wearing brother-in-law. The man who had sat in my mother's immaculate living room just last night, swirling his whiskey and lecturing me about high-level acquisitions. He had boldly told me to swallow my pride and beg my cheating husband for forgiveness, so I would not ruin their impending multi-million-dollar payout. I let the phone buzz for a few seconds, savoring the moment. Bradley was not calling to check on my emotional well-being. Bradley was calling because the financial freeze I had initiated on Marcus's firm had just triggered a massive, unavoidable chain reaction. I swiped the screen and answered the call, bringing the phone to my ear without saying a word. "What the hell is your problem, Chloe?" Bradley barked, his voice loud and completely stripped of his usual condescending smoothness. He was breathing heavily, likely pacing around his own office. I just got a system alert from Sterling Vanguard. My entire investment portal is locked out. My designated portfolio manager cannot even access the trading floor dashboard. What kind of petty, vindictive stunt are you pulling right now? I leaned back in my executive chair, smiling at the sheer predictability of his reaction. Even now, facing a total lockdown of his assets, his first instinct was to blame the discarded wife. He firmly believed I was just throwing a massive hysterical tantrum, perhaps calling a few mutual bankers, or filing some immediate frivolous divorce injunction to temporarily freeze marital assets. He thought I was just being a nuisance, an angry woman making a mess that his golden boy Marcus would eventually have to clean up. "You are going to cost us millions with this little revenge game," Bradley continued, his voice rising in panic and fury. "I told you last night not to ruin the cash cow. Marcus is in the middle of closing the Midtown Plaza deal. I have my son's entire college fund leveraged in his aggressive growth portfolio. Do you understand what a freeze does to my active trade margins? You need to call your divorce lawyers or whoever the hell you manipulated into filing this injunction, and you need to reverse it immediately. You are messing with my money, Chloe." I let him rant. I let him expose every ounce of his greed, his entitlement, and his absolute unwavering blind faith in a man who was actively destroying him. He threw out finance jargon like a shield, trying to intimidate me with words like trade margins and aggressive growth portfolios. He truly thought I was just a wage earner who did not understand the mechanisms of his highly sophisticated world. "Are you finished, Bradley?" I asked, my voice deadly calm and perfectly level. The sheer temperature of my response caught him off guard. He paused, the heavy breathing echoing through the receiver. "Do not play games with me, Chloe," he warned, though the absolute certainty in his voice was beginning to fracture. "Just fix whatever you broke. Marcus is a heavy hitter. He will destroy you in court if you disrupt his firm's operations." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. "I did not break anything, Bradley. I simply turned on the lights. And you are standing in a very empty room. What is that supposed to mean?" He snapped, irritation, masking a sudden sharp spike of genuine anxiety. "You pride yourself on being such a brilliant financial mind, Bradley," I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on my desk. "You lecture me about building generational wealth. You brag about getting in on the ground floor of Marcus's elite investments. But you never actually did your due diligence, did you? You just handed over your son's entire college fund because you were blinded by the custom suits and the leased luxury cars. You wanted to play with the big boys so badly that you forgot to check if the casino was actually real." "Stop talking in riddles," he demanded. "Why is my account frozen?" "Because Marcus does not have your money anymore," I stated, dropping the words like heavy stones into a still pond. "He never invested it in an aggressive growth portfolio. He never leveraged it for the Midtown Plaza acquisition." Bradley let out a harsh, nervous scoff. "You are lying. You are just trying to get back at him because he kicked you out for a younger woman. I saw the quarterly statements last week." "Statements can be fabricated, Bradley, especially by a desperate, over-leveraged broker who is currently drowning in predatory commercial debt." I paused, making sure he was hanging on to every single word. "Instead of yelling at me, you should ask your precious brother-in-law whose neck your kid's college fund is currently hanging around." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. The arrogant, aggressive finance bro had completely vanished. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as the cognitive dissonance tore through his brain. He wanted to call me a liar. He wanted to dismiss me as a jealous, hysterical wife. But the extreme specificity of my statement combined with the terrifying reality of his locked accounts was impossible to ignore. "What are you saying?" Bradley whispered, all the bravado completely drained from his throat. "I am saying you need to look very closely at Jasmine's left hand today," I replied, my voice dropping to a surgical, precise whisper. "Marcus withdrew the entirety of your son's custodial trust account 3 days ago. He did not put it in an escrow account for commercial real estate. He wired it directly to a luxury bridal jeweler in New York City. He bought a flawless 5-carat diamond engagement ring for his 23-year-old assistant, and he bought it with your money." "No!" Bradley gasped, the sound punching out of him like he had just taken a physical blow to the chest. No, that is impossible. The bank would flag it. The compliance officers would stop it. There are no compliance officers, Bradley. There is only Marcus desperately moving stolen money around to keep up his pathetic illusion. I suggest you stop worrying about my divorce tactics and start looking for a very aggressive criminal defense attorney. Because when the federal authorities finish auditing his completely empty firm, you are going to have a very hard time explaining to my sister why her son's future is currently sitting on the ring finger of a receptionist. I did not wait for his response. I did not need to hear his denial, his bargaining, or his inevitable crushing despair. I pressed the red button on my screen and ended the call. I placed the phone face down on my desk. The seed of absolute destruction had just been planted in the very center of my toxic family. Bradley was a greedy, arrogant man, but he was not a passive one. He would not sit quietly and wait for Marcus to explain away a frozen portal. He would hunt Marcus down. He would demand answers. He would look at Jasmine's hand and he would see the exact diamond I had just described. The golden boy of our family, the man my mother worshipped and my sister adored, was about to be torn apart by his own most loyal disciple. I had just turned the wolves loose inside their own pen, and I did not even have to lift a finger to draw blood. I simply unlocked the gate and let the truth do the hunting for me. Let them tear each other to pieces. I had a grand birthday party to prepare for. 2 days later, the air in Atlanta felt thick and heavy, matching the suffocating anticipation building in my chest. My mother's 60th birthday was not just a celebration. To her, it was the ultimate social coronation. She had spent the last 6 months planning this exact evening, curating the guest list to include the wealthiest members of her church and the most influential women in her country club circle. She had secured the private glass-enclosed dining room at the Sovereign, one of the most exclusive and impossibly expensive 5-star restaurants in the entire city. It was a room that offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the glittering Atlanta skyline, the same skyline I completely owned. But tonight was not just about my mother showing off her supposed generational wealth. Tonight was a calculated psychological execution. My sister Nia had graciously forwarded me the final seating chart that morning, framing it as a helpful reminder. I saw exactly what my mother had done. She had not just reserved a seat for my cheating husband. She had deliberately placed Jasmine right next to him at the main family table. It was a masterclass in toxic manipulation. My mother fully intended to use her milestone birthday to publicly force me into submission. She wanted me to walk into that lavish room, see my husband sitting with his new 23-year-old mistress, and realize just how easily I could be replaced. She expected me to break. She expected me to pull Marcus aside in tears and beg him to take me back so I would not be cast out of the elite society she valued above her own flesh and blood. She thought she was playing an elegant game of chess, putting the disobedient daughter in her place to secure the financial future of the family. She simply had no idea she was setting the table for her own absolute slaughter. I stood in the center of my penthouse master suite, staring at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. For the past 10 years, I had dressed specifically to make Marcus look good. I wore muted, neutral tones, elegant but subdued designer pieces that whispered wealth without ever threatening his desperate need to be the center of attention. I had actively dimmed my own light so his fragile ego could cast a shadow. Those days were officially over. I reached into my closet and pulled out the garment bag containing a custom-tailored crimson silk gown. I slipped it on, feeling the heavy, luxurious fabric cascade perfectly over my curves. It was a dress designed to command the absolute attention of every single person in the room. The color was unapologetic. It was the color of power. It was the color of total rebirth. And tonight, it would serve as the vibrant warning flag of their impending destruction. I paired the gown with a pair of sharp black stiletto heels and a diamond necklace that Marcus could not have afforded even on his absolute best day. I did not look like a discarded corporate risk manager. I looked exactly like what I was. The undisputed apex predator of the Atlanta financial district. With my armor perfectly assembled, I walked over to the expansive mahogany desk in my home office. Resting on the smooth surface were 3 thick, black leather-bound folders. I had spent the last 48 hours compiling, printing, and organizing the absolute ruin of the people I used to call family. I ran my manicured fingers over the textured covers, feeling the immense heavy gravity of what was inside. The first folder was for my arrogant brother-in-law, Bradley. I had placed his name on the cover in sharp silver lettering. Inside were the complete, unredacted wire transfer logs showing exactly how Marcus had systematically drained his 5-year-old son college trust fund. I had included the authenticated digital receipts from the New York bridal jeweler, proving that Bradley dreams of a massive real estate partnership were currently sitting on Jasmine's left ring finger. The second folder was for my mother, Brenda. This one was significantly thicker. It contained the devastating forensic accounting of her supposedly booming retirement portfolio. It detailed the exact dates and times Marcus had liquidated her blue-chip stocks. It tracked the stolen money directly to the Buckhead Diamond Boutique, where he had purchased the matching tennis bracelet and pendant that Jasmine would undoubtedly be wearing tonight. I also included the official SEC criminal complaint drafts that my legal team had already prepared, ensuring my mother understood that her golden boy was not just broke, but actively facing federal prison time. The final folder was for Marcus. I did not need to include any bank statements for him. He already knew his accounts were frozen. He already knew the Porsche dealership had humiliated him. He already knew the Buckhead mansion was formally foreclosed upon and padlocked. But he still believed he could somehow talk his way out of it. He still believed he could charm Bradley and my mother into fronting him the cash to hire lawyers and fight the eviction. So his folder contained only one document. It was the official unredacted corporate hierarchy of Apex Capital. It was the undeniable legal proof that the anonymous billionaire syndicate he had been answering to for the last 7 years was the very woman he had kicked out of his house. I stacked the 3 folders together and slid them into a sleek black designer tote bag. I took one last look around the quiet, insulated sanctuary of my penthouse. The storm was ready. I took the private elevator down to the VIP parking garage, where my transportation was already waiting. I was not driving the unassuming black sedan tonight. I walked toward the gleaming, pristine black Maybach parked near the exit. The private chauffeur, a stoic man named Thomas, who had worked for Apex Capital for years, immediately stepped out and opened the heavy rear door for me. "Good evening, Ms. Chloe," Thomas said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. "You look absolutely formidable tonight." "Thank you, Thomas," I replied, sliding into the spacious, luxurious leather interior. "The sovereign, please, and there is no need to rush. I want to make sure everyone is comfortably seated before I arrive." "Understood, Ma," Thomas said, closing the door with a solid, insulated thud. The Maybach glided out of the underground garage and merged seamlessly into the bustling Saturday night traffic of downtown Atlanta. The interior of the car was a sanctuary of perfect silence, completely entirely blocking out the noise of the city. I poured myself a small glass of sparkling water from the chilled crystal decanter built into the center console. I watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows, feeling a profound, icy calm wash over my entire body. Marcus was currently sitting in a 5-star restaurant, desperately pretending his life was not actively imploding. He was likely sweating through his custom suit, praying his credit card would not be needed for the bill, relying entirely on my mother to cover the extravagant cost of the evening. Bradley was sitting there, stewing in paranoid suspicion, glancing at Jasmine's hand, just as I had instructed him to do, waiting for the exact moment to strike. And my mother was sitting at the head of the table, wearing her pearls, and a smug smile, firmly believing she had successfully orchestrated the ultimate humiliation of her oldest daughter. They were all playing their pathetic little roles perfectly. They had gathered themselves in one convenient, highly public location, practically begging for the axe to fall. I rested my hand on the smooth leather of the tote bag, feeling the sharp edges of the 3 folders inside. The calm before the storm is always the most deceiving part of the hurricane. The sky looks clear, the air feels still, and the victims always believe the danger has passed. The Maybach turned onto the opulent valet drive of the Sovereign, pulling up to the towering glass doors of the restaurant. The valet attendants rushed forward, their eyes wide at the sheer presence of the vehicle. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting go of the last lingering shreds of the obedient wife and the dutiful daughter. I stepped out of the car, my red dress flowing into the cool evening air like spilled blood. The game was over. It was time for the execution. The heavy glass doors of the Sovereign parted silently as I walked into the grand lobby. The maitre d' immediately stepped forward, his eyes darting to my vibrant crimson gown and the undeniable aura of authority I carried. He opened his mouth to ask for my reservation, but I simply walked past him without breaking my stride. I did not need to ask for directions to the private dining room. I practically owned the holding company that leased this very floor. As I approached the private elevators, I was joined by three individuals who had been waiting quietly in the opulent lobby lounge. My executive assistant, a sharply dressed man named David, fell into step perfectly on my right side, carrying my designer tote bag that held the three leather-bound folders. Flanking us were two senior corporate litigators from my crisis management firm, both wearing immaculate black suits and expressions carved from solid granite. We moved together as a single unstoppable unit. We were not a family arriving for a birthday dinner. We were a corporate execution squad arriving to liquidate a toxic asset. The elevator doors opened directly onto the VIP penthouse level. The muffled sounds of polite laughter and clinking crystal drifted from behind the towering mahogany double doors at the end of the hall. I paused for a fraction of a second, centering myself, letting the raw power of the moment settle into my bones. Then I placed both hands on the brass handles and pushed the heavy doors open with a forceful synchronized shove. The doors swung wide, hitting the padded walls with a dull, resonant thud. The polite chatter inside the opulent dining room died instantly. The private dining room of the Sovereign was a monument to excess. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting fractured light across the silver cutlery and the imported floral arrangements. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the glittering Atlanta skyline, a skyline that I quietly dominated. This was the exact setting my mother had demanded to showcase her imagined superiority. She had wanted a stage, and I was about to use it for a public execution. If a camera were filming this exact moment, it would start right behind my shoulder, capturing the sheer visual shock of my entrance, before detaching and beginning a slow, deliberate 360-degree tracking shot around the lavishly decorated table. The lens would sweep past my mother first. Brenda was seated at the head of the table wearing a silver sequined dress and her signature pearls, her wine glass frozen halfway to her mouth. The smug satisfaction she had been radiating just a second ago was rapidly curdling into deeply offended outrage. The camera would glide over to my sister Nia, who sat with a forkful of expensive sea bass suspended in midair. Her face contorted with petty annoyance, her eyes darting between my custom gown and her own, off-the-rack dress, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and intense jealousy at the sheer dominance of my crimson silk. Next to her, the tracking shot would capture Bradley. The arrogant finance bro was sweating profusely. He was not looking at my dress. He was staring directly at the two ruthless corporate lawyers standing behind me. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the table, his mind racing through the terrifying phone call we had shared hours earlier. He was staring intensely across the table at Jasmine, and the horrifying realization setting in as the brilliant sparkle of the 5-carat diamond matched exactly what I had warned him about. The lens would continue its smooth rotation, landing on the guest of honor at the opposite end of the table, Marcus. He was wearing his best Tom Ford tuxedo, desperately projecting the image of a wealthy, unbothered titan. But the camera would catch the microscopic tremor in his jaw, the terrified realization flashing in his eyes that his frozen bank accounts and his foreclosed mansion were suddenly walking through the door. Clinging tightly to his arm was Jasmine. The 23-year-old assistant was giggling softly, a sound completely out of place in the suddenly freezing room. The camera would zoom in on her neck and her left hand, capturing the brilliant, blinding sparkle of the stolen diamond pendant and the engagement ring she proudly wore. She lifted her left hand to casually brush a stray hair behind her ear. purposefully flashing the massive diamond ring in the ambient light, completely oblivious to the fact that they were bought with the stolen college funds of the man sitting just 3 chairs away. The silence hung in the room for 5 agonizing seconds before my mother shattered it. Brenda slammed her crystal wine glass onto the table, the red liquid splashing over the rim and staining the pristine white tablecloth. She jumped to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the polished hardwood floor. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my chest. "Who let you in here?" Brenda shrieked, her carefully cultivated southern elegance completely disintegrating into raw, toxic fury. "I explicitly told the staff this was a private family event. You have no right to be here. This is a celebration of my life, my legacy, and the success of this family. You walk in here trying to upstage us, bringing strangers into a private VIP suite. You are ruining this family image. You are a bitter, jealous woman, Chloe. You could not keep your husband happy, and now you want to ruin our evening just because he found a woman who knows how to treat a successful man. You march out of here right now before you humiliate us in front of the entire restaurant." Jasmine pressed herself closer to Marcus, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh. She looked at me with the brazen confidence of a woman who honestly believed she had won the grand prize. She leaned into Marcus, whispering something inaudible, but clearly mocking, her eyes tracing the lines of my red dress with pathetic amusement. She honestly believed she was untouchable, protected by the grand illusion of the man sitting next to her. Marcus, emboldened by my mother's outrage and desperate to maintain the illusion of control in front of his new fiancée, stood up violently. He was sweating. The crisp collar of his tuxedo shirt suddenly looked too tight. He threw his linen napkin onto his empty plate and pointed at the door. "Security!" Marcus bellowed, his voice echoing loudly off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. "Get security up here immediately! I am a platinum member here. Get the manager. This woman is trespassing. I want her and these people escorted out of the building in handcuffs if necessary. Throw her out right now." He shouted the commands with the desperate volume of a cornered animal. He wanted a scene. He wanted the restaurant staff to rush in and drag me away, validating his narrative that I was just a crazy, jealous, discarded wife, making a desperate scene at a civilized gathering. He thought volume equated to power. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. The devastating emotional wreck they were all eagerly waiting to see simply did not exist. I stood at the head of the room, flanked by my legal team, radiating an intimidating glacial calm that seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. I stepped forward, the sharp click of my stiletto heels echoing clearly over the frantic shouting. I walked slowly toward the massive dining table, my eyes locked dead onto Marcus. The closer I got, the more his false bravado began to crack. He could see the absolute lack of fear in my expression. He could see the 2 corporate litigators stepping into the room behind me, closing the heavy double doors and locking the deadbolt with a loud final click, sealing everyone inside. "No one is calling security, Marcus," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and carrying the lethal weight of an absolute guarantee. "And no one is leaving this room." I gestured slightly with my left hand. David, my assistant, stepped forward and placed the sleek black designer tote bag directly onto the center of the dining table, right next to my mother's elaborate floral centerpiece. He unzipped the bag with a sharp sound that made Bradley physically flinch in his seat. "Because tonight we are not celebrating a birthday," I continued, letting my gaze sweep slowly across the faces of my mother, my sister, my brother-in-law, and finally landing on the cheating husband who had foolishly tried to bury me. "Tonight, we are conducting a hostile corporate audit, and every single person sitting at this table is severely overdrawn." I reached into the black tote bag David had placed on the table. The room was so deathly quiet that the slide of leather against leather sounded like a blade being unsheathed. Marcus opened his mouth to shout for security again, but one of my corporate litigators simply placed a hand on the back of an empty dining chair, offering a single chilling glare that instantly silenced him. I pulled out the 3 thick, heavy folders. I did not hand them out politely. I tossed them onto the pristine white tablecloth. They landed with a heavy, definitive slap that made the silver cutlery rattle against the fine china. I picked up the first folder, the thickest of the three, and slid it directly across the table until it hit the base of my mother crystal wine glass. "Happy 60th birthday, Mother," I said, my voice dripping with absolute ice. "You spent your entire life worshipping at the altar of this man's supposed wealth. Open it. Inside, you will find the complete forensic accounting of your cherished retirement portfolio. You will see the exact dates Marcus completely liquidated your secure blue-chip stocks. And more importantly, you will see the unredacted wire transfers proving he used your entire life savings to buy that brilliant diamond tennis bracelet currently sitting on his mistress' wrist." My mother face drained of all color, instantly transforming her from a smug, arrogant matriarch into a terrified, aging woman. Her eyes darted frantically from the black folder on the table to the diamonds glittering brightly against Jasmine's skin. I picked up the second folder and tossed it effortlessly down the length of the table toward Bradley. It hit his dinner plate, knocking over his expensive water goblet and soaking the tablecloth. "You wanted to play in the big leagues, Bradley," I continued, turning my cold, piercing gaze to my arrogant brother-in-law. "You lectured me about aggressive growth strategies and nine-figure commercial acquisitions. That folder contains the digital receipts showing exactly how Marcus diverted your son's entire college fund and your personal investment capital straight into Jasmine personal shopping accounts. Your promised generational wealth just bought her a 5-carat engagement ring and a new designer wardrobe." Bradley let out a choked, breathless gasp. He tore the folder open with violently trembling hands, his eyes frantically scanning the heavily highlighted bank statements and transfer logs. His jaw dropped and a sickening shade of pale washed over his face as the absolute reality of his financial ruin finally set in. Finally, I picked up the last folder. I did not throw this one. I walked slowly around the table, the crimson silk of my gown brushing against the backs of the chairs until I stood directly behind Marcus. He was frozen, his breathing shallow and rapid. I dropped the folder onto the table right in front of him. "That is an official eviction notice signed this afternoon by the Fulton County Sheriff," I whispered, leaning down so my voice carried right next to his ear. "Apex Capital owns your commercial debt, Marcus. I own Apex Capital. You and your little assistant have exactly until 9 in the morning to vacate my property before you are physically dragged out onto the lawn by armed deputies." I stood up straight, smoothing the front of my gown. I looked around the room at the shattered, devastated faces of the people who had so eagerly plotted my downfall just 24 hours ago. "Everyone loves keeping up appearances, right?" I asked, my voice echoing clearly in the stunned, absolute silence of the VIP suite. "Then take a good look at the makeup of the truth." The heavy silence that followed my words lasted exactly 3 seconds before the entire illusion violently shattered. Bradley, the man who had built his entire identity on projecting an aura of untouchable elite superiority, completely lost his mind. A guttural sound of pure, unadulterated rage ripped from his throat. He did not ask for clarification. He did not wait for Marcus to offer a smooth, calculated excuse. Bradley vaulted forward, his chest crashing into the table and sending crystal water goblets shattering across the polished hardwood floor. He lunged across the elaborate floral centerpiece, ignoring the breaking china, and grabbed Marcus directly by the lapels of his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. If a lens were capturing this moment, it would abandon the smooth, cinematic tracking shots of the evening and switch instantly to a shaky, frantic handheld style, perfectly mirroring the sudden explosion of chaotic realism. Bradley hauled Marcus halfway out of his chair, shaking him with a terrifying, unpredictable violence. "You conned me!" Bradley roared. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, a stark contrast to his usual pale composure. "You stole from my son. Where's my kid's money, you pathetic fraud? Where is it?" Marcus sputtered, his hands coming up weakly to pry Bradley's white-knuckled fingers off his collar. The arrogant titan of finance was gone, replaced by a terrified, sweating coward. His eyes were wide with absolute panic as he choked on his own tailored collar, unable to formulate a single lie to save himself. To their left, the devastation compounded. My mother had finally peeled her eyes away from the forensic accounting of her completely drained retirement fund. The reality of her total social and financial ruin hit her nervous system like a physical blow. She let out a single thin gasp, her eyes rolling back. She collapsed backward, her body going entirely limp as she fainted dead away in her velvet chair. Nia shrieked, dropping her wineglass and scrambling to catch our mother's slumping frame, her own face twisted in absolute helpless panic. Amidst the shouting, the shrieking, and the sound of shattering glass, Jasmine finally connected the dots. She stared at the manic brawl happening inches away from her, listening to Bradley scream about stolen trust funds, empty accounts, and fake investments. The glamorous, endlessly wealthy lifestyle she thought she had successfully stolen was rapidly dissolving into a nightmare of federal indictments, zero balances, and an impending morning eviction. Her opportunistic survival instinct kicked in with ruthless, blinding speed. She grabbed her left hand violently, twisting the flawless 5-carat diamond engagement ring off her finger. She threw the heavy ring directly onto the ruined dining table, the gem bouncing against a broken plate with a sharp, heavy clink. "You said you were a millionaire!" Jasmine screamed at Marcus, her voice cracking with furious, bitter disgust. She did not wait for him to look at her. She did not care that he was currently being strangled by his own brother-in-law. She turned on her heel, her designer shoes slipping slightly on the spilled wine, before she caught her balance and bolted frantically for the double doors, abandoning the sinking ship without a single ounce of hesitation. I stood perfectly still, flanked by my silent legal team, watching the absolute destruction of my enemies unfold exactly as I had designed it. Bradley finally released his grip, shoving Marcus backward with a disgusted shout before pacing the room like a caged animal. Marcus stumbled, his custom tuxedo torn and his face bruised from the violent altercation. The reality of his absolute ruin finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his unearned arrogance. He dropped heavily to his knees, his eyes darting frantically around the shattered dining room before locking onto me. He crawled across the ruined floor, ignoring the broken crystal and spilled wine until he collapsed right at the tips of my sharp stiletto heels. He reached out with trembling hands, grasping the hem of my crimson gown. He begged me to stop the foreclosure. He pleaded with me to use my wealth to save him, babbling desperately about the encrypted black USB drive he suddenly realized was missing from his safe, convinced it was the only leverage he had left to negotiate his way out of this nightmare. I did not pull away. I slowly crouched down, the rustle of my silk dress the only sound in the immediate space between us. If a camera were positioned on the floor, it would capture a low-angle extreme close-up of my face, highlighting the cold, triumphant half-smile curving my lips. I reached out and firmly lifted his bruised chin, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. "You brought your lover into my house," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. "You used my money to keep her. Did you think I stayed quiet because I was weak? No, Marcus. I stayed quiet because I was busy buying up all your debt. And this USB, I handed it over to the FBI an hour ago." The blood completely drained from his face as the faint, unmistakable wail of police sirens pierced the thick glass windows of the penthouse. The heavy double doors of the VIP suite were suddenly thrown open. A team of federal agents, flanked by local police, stormed into the room. They bypassed me entirely, moving with swift, tactical precision. 2 agents hauled Marcus to his feet, slamming him against the wall and snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. A 3rd agent moved directly toward Bradley, arresting him on the spot for active complicity and participation in an unregistered fraudulent investment fund. Bradley screamed his innocence, but his frantic protests were completely useless against the crushing weight of the federal warrants. The commotion startled my mother. Brenda jolted awake from her fainting spell, her eyes wide with fresh horror as she watched her golden boy son-in-law and her precious real estate partner being dragged out of the restaurant in cuffs. She scrambled to her feet, tears ruining her expensive makeup, and grabbed my hand. She sobbed hysterically, begging me to call my lawyers to use my corporate power to save the family from this catastrophic public humiliation. I looked at the woman who had demanded I endure blatant betrayal to protect her fake social status. I gently but firmly pulled my hand out of her desperate grasp. I turned my back on the wreckage and walked out the door without a single backward glance. 20 minutes later, I sat comfortably in the plush leather seat of my Maybach, the tinted windows shielding me as the car glided smoothly through the glowing Atlanta night. I poured a fresh glass of sparkling water, leaned back, and looked directly into the camera lens. They call me cold-blooded, but sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't screaming or breaking things. The sweetest revenge is letting the people who betrayed you drown in their own delusions while you quietly gather up all the life rafts. That day, I didn't just walk away from a toxic marriage. I walked away from a family system that saw me as a tool. If you are being looked down upon, don't argue. Prepare. Have you ever had to walk away in silence to protect your worth? Tell me in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of awakening.